Hi, I'm Margaret. I'm 74 years old, and 3 months ago, my own daughter took the keys to my house right out of my hand at the dinner table in front of my neighbor and told me it wasn't safe for me to have them anymore. This is the house I paid for with 31 years of my own paychecks. This is the house where I raised her, and for a few long weeks, I was not allowed to lock or unlock my own front door without asking permission first. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I know some of you already feel it in your chest. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from being cared for the wrong way, from people who love you turning your own home into something you have to be granted access to. It does not look like abuse from the outside. It looks like concern. It looks like a daughter who worries. But underneath it, it is something else entirely, and I lived inside that something else for almost a year before I understood what I actually had to do about it. Have you ever had someone you love decide, without asking you, that you were no longer capable of running your own life? Maybe it was a parent, maybe it was a spouse, maybe it was your own child, the way it was for me. Where are you listening from right now? I would love to know, because I have a feeling this story is going to feel familiar to more of you than you would expect. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, I would be so grateful if you did. It costs nothing, and it is the only way we get to keep telling stories like mine, stories about people who got quietly pushed aside and found their way back to themselves. Go ahead and drop a comment telling me what town you are listening from tonight. I read every single one, and honestly, on the harder nights, those comments are what keep me going. I live on Willow Creek Road, just outside Roanoke, Virginia, in a white house with green shutters that my late husband Frank and I bought in 1983. Frank worked at the freight yard for 36 years. I taught third grade at Fairview Elementary for 29 of those years, right up until my knees gave out and I finally let myself retire. We paid that mortgage off together, dollar by dollar, through 2 recessions and one very bad year when Frank got laid off for 11 months. I remember standing in the kitchen the day we made the last payment, both of us just looking at each other like we could not believe it. Frank passed 6 years ago, from his heart in his sleep in the bedroom upstairs. The deed to this house has had my name on it since the week we closed, and after Frank died, it passed to me alone. The way our lawyer had always set it up, clean and simple, right there on paper at the county recorder's office. My daughter Diane is 46 now. She is my only child, and I love her. I need you to understand that, because none of what I am about to tell you comes from a place where I stopped loving her. She married a man named David about 19 years ago. David sells commercial real estate, and he's good at it, good enough that they live in a new development on the other side of town with a 3-car garage and a leased Range Rover that he trades in every 2 years. 2 years ago, Diane came to me and said she and David wanted to move in with me for a while to help me out since I was getting older and living alone. I said yes without hesitating because what mother would not want her daughter close? I did not know then that saying yes to that question was going to cost me almost everything I thought I still controlled. At first it really did feel like help. Diane repainted my kitchen. David fixed the gutter that had been sagging for 3 years. My grandchildren, Emma who is 16 and Caleb who is 12, started coming down the hall in the mornings for breakfast before school, and I loved hearing their feet on my floor again. I want to be honest with you, those first 4 or 5 months were sweet. I felt less alone than I had felt since Frank passed. But somewhere around month 6, something started to shift, so slowly that I almost could not put my finger on it, the way a room gets darker as the sun goes down and you do not notice until you cannot read your own book anymore. It started with small decisions. Diane started answering the phone when it rang, telling whoever called that Mom was resting, even when I was sitting 3 feet away, wide awake, perfectly capable of talking. David started handling the mail, sorting it into piles on the counter, and one day I realized I had not actually opened an envelope addressed to me in almost a month. At my own family reunion, when my brother asked how I was doing managing the house, Diane answered for me before I could open my mouth, said something like, "We're keeping a close eye on things, Mom's doing wonderfully with our help." I sat there with my mouth half open and a smile frozen on my face because what do you say to that in front of everyone without making a scene? The phrase that started showing up most often was, "It's for your own good." I heard it when they decided I should not drive after dark anymore, Even though my eyes are fine, and I have never had an accident in 58 years of driving, I heard it when Diane started coming with me to my own doctor's appointments and doing most of the talking. I heard it when they quietly moved my checkbook from the kitchen drawer into a locked filing cabinet in what used to be my sewing room, which David had turned into a home office without asking me. Each time, on its own, it sounded almost reasonable, almost caring. It was only when I lined them all up in my mind, one after another, that I understood I was being managed, not loved, at least not in the way that respects a grown woman's right to run her own life. My grandchildren noticed before I let myself admit it out loud. Emma started giving me these long, careful looks across the dinner table, the kind of look a teenager gives you when she wants to say something but is not sure it is her place. One evening when her parents were out on the back patio, she came and sat next to me on the couch and said, "Grandma, is everything okay with the house?" I remember my throat tightening, and I told her everything was fine because I did not want to put that weight on a 16-year-old. But her question stayed with me for days. If a child could see it, plain as day, then it was not my imagination. Something in my own home had quietly turned upside down, and I had been too polite, too grateful, too used to giving in to say a word. I started to notice how differently David and Diane talked about the house itself. Not my house anymore, just the house, as in, we're thinking about redoing the house, as in, once we finish updating the house, it'll be worth so much more. David would walk through the rooms with his phone out, taking pictures of the crown molding and the old hardwood floors, talking numbers with Diane in low voices at the kitchen table after I had gone to bed, or at least after they thought I had gone to bed. I would stand at the top of the stairs in my robe and listen to them discuss square footage and comparable sales in the neighborhood, like I was a line item in a spreadsheet instead of the woman who scrubbed those floors on her hands and knees for 30 years. I remember one particular night standing there at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing with both hands, feeling something between grief and fury settle into my stomach like a stone dropped into still water. Below me I could hear David's voice, low and businesslike, saying something about a 6-figure return once the market in our neighborhood finished climbing the way it had been climbing for 2 years. Diane laughed softly at something he said, the easy, comfortable laugh of two people planning a future they were certain belonged to them. I stood there in the dark for what felt like a long time, in my own hallway, in my own home, feeling like a ghost haunting a house that had not yet realized it still belonged to me. What hurt the most in those early months was not any single thing they did. It was the way my own opinions started to disappear from conversations about my own life. If I said I wanted to keep the wallpaper in the hallway because Frank had hung it himself the summer before he died, Diane would smile that patient smile and say, "We'll talk about it later, Mom," in the exact tone you would use with a child who wants candy before dinner. If I said I felt fine driving myself to church on Sunday mornings, David would glance at Diane and Diane would say, "Let's just play it safe this week," in a voice that made it clear the decision had already been made without me. I started to notice I was saying yes to things I did not agree with, simply because arguing had started to feel exhausting in a way it never used to. I started rehearsing conversations in my head before I ever had them, the way you might rehearse a difficult parent-teacher meeting, choosing my words carefully, softening them in advance, trying to guess which sentence might set Diane off and which one might slide by unnoticed. I hated that I had started doing that in my own home, with my own daughter, a woman I had once rocked to sleep in my arms in this very house. But fear does strange things to the way you speak, even a quiet, well-mannered kind of fear, the kind that never once raises its voice but still manages to keep you constantly on guard. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from being disagreed with gently over and over by people who insist they only want what is best for you. It wears you down differently than a fight would. A fight you can push back, against. This was softer than that, and somehow heavier. Every time I tried to raise my voice even a little, Diane would tilt her head and say something like, "Why are you getting so upset? We're just trying to help you." And then somehow I was the one who felt unreasonable, felt difficult, felt like the problem, in the very house where I had once been the one making every single decision, from what we ate for supper to how we spent our savings. I remember one Tuesday afternoon, David sat me down at the kitchen table with a folder of papers. He said it was just some paperwork to make things easier if anything ever happened to me, nothing to worry about, standard stuff everybody our age should have in place. He mentioned something about a power of attorney, said it would let them help me pay bills and handle appointments without me having to be bothered with all the little details. I remember him saying, "This way, if you're ever not feeling up to it, we can just take care of things. You won't even have to think about it." I signed it. I want to be honest with you about that, because I am not going to pretend I was perfectly sharp and suspicious that whole day. I trusted my daughter. I trusted the man she married. I signed where David pointed, and I did not read every line the way I should have, because he made it sound so small, so ordinary, so far away from anything that would ever actually matter. Looking back now, I understand that paper was never about paying my electric bill. That paper became, in David and Diane's minds, a kind of master key to my entire life. A permission slip they carried around in their heads, even in places it never legally reached. But I'm getting ahead of myself because at the time I had no idea what that folder would end up meaning. All I knew in the months right after I signed it was that the two of them started treating certain decisions as already settled, decisions that used to be entirely mine, and they stopped asking my opinion on things they used to at least pretend to consult me about. My grandson Caleb, who is 12 and usually more interested in his video games than anything happening around him, came into the kitchen one Saturday morning while I was making pancakes and asked me straight out, "Grandma, do you still own this house?" I nearly dropped the spatula. I asked him why on earth he would ask something like that, and he just shrugged and said he heard his dad on the phone talking about equity and renovations and getting the place ready to sell in a few years. A 12-year-old boy had picked up on a plan for my own future that nobody had bothered discussing with me. I told him, of course, I still owned the house, and I smiled and finished making his pancakes, but my hands were shaking a little by the time I set the plate down in front of him. I started keeping things to myself after that, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I was starting to understand that anything I said out loud in that house could be used later, twisted a little, turned into evidence that Mom's getting confused or Mom's having a hard time keeping up. I began writing small notes to myself in a spiral notebook I kept in my nightstand drawer. Dates and details, little things like the day Diane told my neighbor Nancy that I had forgotten to pay the water bill, when I had not forgotten anything. David had simply intercepted the bill and paid it late himself while sorting my mail. I did not know yet what I was going to do with that notebook. I only knew, somewhere deep in my gut, that I might need it someday. At Sunday dinner one week, my brother Harold came to visit from Lynchburg, and he asked me, right there at the table, how I was doing managing everything on my own since Frank passed. Before I could answer, Diane jumped in and said, "Honestly, we've had to take over most of it. Mom's not really up for handling the finances and the house stuff anymore. We're just trying to protect her." Harold nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable thing to hear about his own sister. A woman who taught third grade for 29 years and balanced a household budget every single month of her married life without ever once missing a payment. I sat there with my fork in my hand and said nothing, because by then, saying something had started to feel pointless. That was the night I went to bed and cried for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears into my pillow. The kind you cry when you finally admit something to yourself that you have been avoiding for months. I lay there in the dark, in the bedroom Frank and I had shared for 33 years, and I thought, when did I stop being the woman who ran this house and become someone people talk about in the third person at my own dinner table? I did not have an answer that night. I only knew something in me had started to harden, quietly, underneath all that exhaustion, and it would take a few more months before I understood exactly what that hardening was preparing me to do. I want to tell you what that house sounded like at night during those months, because sound matters more than people realize when you are trying to hold on to a sense of who you are. The furnace clicking on around 10. The particular creak of the third stair, the one Frank always meant to fix and never did. My own slippers on the hardwood, a sound I had heard every night for 4 decades, except now I found myself listening for other sounds too, low voices behind a closed office door. The soft click of a laptop closing quickly when I walked past. A house that used to feel like an extension of my own body had started to feel like a place I was a guest inside, listening carefully the way you listen in someone else's home when you are not quite sure where you are allowed to sit. There was a Sunday at church that stayed with me longer than it probably should have. Our pastor's wife, a kind woman named Ellen, who had known me since Frank and I first joined that congregation in 1985, stopped Diane in the fellowship hall and asked how I was doing these days since I had missed a few Wednesday Bible studies. I was standing right there, close enough to answer for myself, and Diane said, "Oh, Mom's doing okay. We're just watching her pretty closely these days, keeping her comfortable." Ellen looked past Diane's shoulder at me, and I smiled and said I was doing just fine, thank you, and I could handle my own Wednesday nights whenever I chose to attend them. But I remember the drive home, gripping the wheel a little tighter than necessary, wondering how many other conversations like that one had already happened without me in the room at all. I started noticing how tired I was of proving I was still myself. 37 years in a classroom teaches you how to read a room, how to notice which child is struggling before he raises his hand, how to hold a lesson plan and a discipline chart and a parent's worried phone call all in your head at the same time without dropping a single thread. I had run a household, buried a husband, managed a mortgage, balanced a checkbook down to the penny every month for half a century, and somehow in the space of 18 months I had become someone my own family discussed in hushed tones, as though sharpness was something you could simply misplace like a set of reading glasses. That contradiction sat heavy in me some nights, heavier than almost anything else in this whole story. If any part of this is sounding familiar to you, if you have ever felt yourself slowly edited out of your own life by people who insist they love you, I want you to know you are not imagining it and you are not alone in it. This channel exists because so many of us have lived some version of this story and never had anyone to tell it to. Subscribing does not cost you a thing, and it genuinely helps us keep finding and sharing stories like mine. If you're still with me, tell me in the comments. Has anyone ever made a decision about your life without asking you first? I read every word, and I promise you, it helps more than you know just to be heard. Around the 8-month mark, things started moving faster, the way a car rolls faster once it crests a hill. David came home one evening with a man I did not recognize, introduced him as a friend from his office who did home renovations on the side. The two of them walked through my house with a tape measure and a clipboard, talking about knocking out the wall between the kitchen and the dining room, talking about what the place could be worth if it were opened up and modernized. Nobody asked me if I wanted my walls knocked out. Nobody asked if I even wanted a renovation at all. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and watched two men discuss tearing down a wall. Frank and I had eaten breakfast beside for 33 years, and neither of them looked at me once the whole time they talked. That same week, David installed a keypad lock on the front door, the kind you see on rental properties, replacing the old brass deadbolt Frank had put in himself back in the 90s. He told me it was for convenience, said I would not have to fumble with keys anymore, all I had to do was punch in a code. He gave me the code on a little sticky note, and I used it for about 2 weeks before I noticed the code had quietly changed one Thursday without anyone telling me. I stood on my own porch for 11 minutes in the cold before Caleb happened to come to the door and let me in, looking almost embarrassed, saying his dad must have forgotten to tell me they changed it again for security reasons. I did not make a scene that day either. I want you to understand something about who I was at that point in my life. I had spent 50 years being the peacemaker in my family, the one who smoothed things over, who kept her voice even, who believed that a calm household was worth almost any price. That instinct did not disappear overnight, just because something inside me had started to shift. So I thanked Caleb, I went inside, I hung up my coat, and later that night I wrote the date and the details in my spiral notebook with a steadier hand than I expected. Something in me was starting to keep score, even while the rest of me kept smiling at the dinner table. The mini-turn, if you want to call it that, came from an unexpected place. My neighbor Nancy, who has lived 2 doors down since 1991, stopped me at my own mailbox one afternoon and asked very carefully if everything was all right at the house. She said she had noticed a realtor's car parked in my driveway twice in the last month, and she had seen a man taking photographs of the exterior from the sidewalk one Saturday morning while I was apparently not home. I told her I had not authorized any realtor to photograph my house, and I watched her face change, watched her realize that I genuinely did not know what she was talking about. That was the moment the fog started to clear a little. It was one thing to feel pushed aside inside my own walls. It was another thing entirely to learn that people outside my walls were seeing plans for my future that I had never agreed to. I started paying closer attention after that conversation with Nancy. I noticed how David always seemed to know exactly when I napped in the afternoon, and how certain visitors seemed to come and go during those hours. I noticed a manila envelope on David's desk in what used to be my sewing room, and though I did not open it, I saw enough of the letterhead through the open flap to recognize the name of a mortgage company 2 towns over. I noticed Diane had started referring to the house in front of Emma and Caleb as an investment property. A phrase I do not think either of my grandchildren fully understood the weight of, but I understood it perfectly. An investment is something you plan to sell. That word, investment, kept me up more than one night that week. This was the house where Frank taught Diane to ride a bicycle in the driveway, where we hung a wooden swing from the oak tree out back that still creaks a little in the wind, where I rocked Diane through fevers and later rocked Emma and Caleb through their own, all in the same rocking chair that still sits by my bedroom window. None of that shows up on a real estate listing. None of that gets factored into square footage or comparable sales. To David and Diane, in those quiet late-night conversations at my kitchen table, this house had apparently become a number on a spreadsheet, a line that could be improved and sold for a profit. To me, it was still the only place on earth that held every important thing that had ever happened in my life, and I could not understand how those two realities were sitting inside the same 4 walls without anyone else seeming to notice the contradiction. I started spending my mornings differently after that. Instead of my usual crossword puzzle, I began quietly reading whatever I could find about deeds, about power of attorney, about what those documents could and could not actually do sitting at the library 2 towns over, so nobody at home would notice the books I brought home and returned before dinner. I did not fully understand every legal term I read, I will be honest with you about that, but I understood enough to know that a form allowing someone to help pay your bills is not the same thing in the eyes of the law as a form transferring ownership of your home, no matter how many times my daughter said the two things in the same breath at my own dinner table. I worried more than anything else during that stretch of time about what all of this was teaching Emma and Caleb. Children absorb far more than we give them credit for. I did not want my grandchildren growing up believing that this is simply what happens to people once they reach a certain age. That autonomy is something you are allowed to keep only until your children decide otherwise. I made a quiet promise to myself, somewhere in the middle of that difficult stretch, that whatever I ended up doing about my own situation, I wanted it to teach those two kids something different, something truer, about what it looks like for a woman to stand her ground with grace instead of disappearing quietly into somebody else's decision about her own life. One evening I finally asked Diane directly, sitting across from her at the kitchen table after the kids had gone up to do their homework. I asked her plainly, "Are you and David planning to sell this house?" She did not answer right away, which told me almost everything I needed to know before she said a single word. Then she said, "Mom, nothing's decided yet. We're just exploring options. We want what's best for everyone, including you, especially considering how much upkeep a house like this needs at your age." I asked her what she meant by exploring options, and she said something vague about a smaller condo closer to David's office, somewhere with fewer stairs, somewhere easier to manage. She said it like she was describing a kindness she was preparing to hand me. I told her calmly that I had no interest in leaving the home I had lived in for over 40 years, the home where her father was buried from, the home where she herself had grown up. Diane's face did something I had not seen before, a kind of tightening around her eyes, and she said, "Mom, Be reasonable. You can't keep living somewhere this size by yourself forever. David and I have power of attorney now. We're allowed to make these decisions if it comes to that. I remember the exact chill that went through me when she said the words allowed to make these decisions, as though a piece of paper I had signed to help pay bills had somehow in her mind become permission to sell the roof over my head without my consent. That conversation sat in my stomach like a stone for days. I did not sleep well. I kept replaying the words aloud to make these decisions over and over, trying to understand how my daughter had come to believe that a form I signed at my own kitchen table gave her authority over my deed, over my home, over the one thing in this world that had never belonged to anyone but Frank and me, and now only me. I started to understand that whatever was coming next was not going to resolve itself quietly on its own. Something was building in that house, the way pressure builds behind a dam, and I had a feeling deep in my bones that it was going to break loose in front of other people, not just behind closed doors. It happened on a Friday night at what should have been an ordinary dinner. Nancy from next door had come over the way she often did, bringing a pan of her cornbread, sitting in what had always been her usual chair at my table for 20 years. Emma and Caleb were there, David was carving the chicken, and for a little while it almost felt like the old days before all of this started. Then, out of nowhere, in the middle of passing the green beans, Diane looked at me and said, "Mom, I need your keys, all of them, the house key and the spare for the shed." I asked her why, trying to keep my voice light in front of Nancy, and Diane said, "It's just not safe anymore for you to be locking and unlocking doors. We've been reading about seniors getting confused and wandering or leaving doors unlocked overnight. We just want everyone to feel secure." I sat there for a moment with my fork halfway to my mouth, and I looked around that table, at Nancy who had gone very still, at Emma who was staring down at her plate, at Caleb, who would not lift his eyes at all, at David, who suddenly found something fascinating about the chicken on his plate. And I understood in that exact second that this was not a private request. This was a performance, staged in front of a witness, designed to make refusing look unreasonable, designed to make me the difficult one if I said no in front of company. So Diane held out her hand across my own dinner table, in my own dining room, under the light fixture Frank had installed himself, and she waited. I want to tell you I fought back right there. I want to tell you I stood up and said, "Absolutely not. This is my house. These are my keys." But that is not what happened, and I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would tell it honestly. What happened is that I reached into my cardigan pocket and I took out my key ring, the one with the little brass angel Frank gave me the Christmas before he died, and I set it in my daughter's open palm. I did it quietly. I did it with my chin up because I was not going to let her see my hand shake. But inside, something in me broke clean in half at that table, in front of Nancy, in front of my own grandchildren, in front of the man my daughter married. After dinner, once Nancy had gone home and the kids were upstairs, I stood at my own front door and realized I could not lock it myself anymore. There was no keyhole for me to use, even if I had kept a spare, because the keypad had already replaced the old lock months before, and now even that keypad code belonged entirely to David and Diane. I was standing in the doorway of the house I had lived in for over 4 decades, unable to secure my own front door for the night without asking my daughter or her husband for a 4-digit number. I stood there a long time in the dark hallway, just looking at that keypad glowing faintly on the door, and I felt something I had never quite felt before in my whole life. Not sadness exactly, something colder and clearer than sadness. I did not cry that night. I want you to notice that, because it matters to what comes next. I did not yell. I did not confront anyone. I did not even bring it up again the following morning at breakfast. Instead, I went up to my bedroom, sat down at Frank's old writing desk by the window, and I opened that spiral notebook I had been keeping, and I wrote down everything, the exact words Diane had used, the date, the fact that Nancy had witnessed it, the fact that my own grandchildren had not looked me in the eye. Then I closed the notebook and I made a decision. I was not going to raise my voice in that house again. I was going to be quiet and patient, and I was going to become very, very organized. The next morning, while Diane and David were both at work and the kids were at school, I drove myself, still able to drive, whatever they had decided about that, over to the county recorder's office downtown. I asked to speak with an old friend of mine, a woman named Linda Mercer, who I had known since our sons and daughters were in the same Girl Scout troop together 30 years ago, and who had worked as a clerk, and later a title examiner at that office for almost as long as I had taught school. I sat down across from Linda in a small office that smelled like coffee and old paper, and I told her everything, calmly, the way I would have explained a lesson plan to a substitute teacher, without a single tear, because I had already cried plenty in private. Linda listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. When I finished, she pulled up the county records right there on her computer screen and turned it around so I could see it myself. The deed to my house, recorded in 1983, transferred solely into my name after Frank's passing through the right of survivorship clause we had set up decades earlier, still exactly as it had always been. No other name had ever been added. No transfer had ever been filed. Whatever David and Diane believed that power of attorney gave them, it had never touched the deed itself, not one word of it, not one signature. Linda looked at me over her glasses and said, "Margaret, whatever they think they can do with this house, they cannot do it without you, and they certainly cannot do it without your signature on an actual deed transfer, which does not exist." I sat in Linda's little office for a long while after that, longer than I probably needed to, just staring at my own name on that screen, printed clean and permanent in the county records the way it had been for over 40 years. I thought about Frank, about the day we signed those original papers at a folding table in a lawyer's office that smelled like burnt coffee, both of us so young and so nervous about the size of that mortgage. I thought about the little brass angel on my key ring, the one Diane now carried in her own purse, a gift Frank had bought me the December before his heart gave out, and how strange it was that something so small could end up meaning so much once it was gone from my hand. I did not cry in Linda's office, but I let myself feel the full weight of it, sitting there before I straightened my back and asked her what I needed to do next. Linda spent the better part of an hour walking me through it, step by step, the way I imagine I once walked a nervous third grader through long division. She explained that a revocation of power of attorney needed to be in writing, signed by me, notarized properly, and ideally delivered or made known to David and Diane, so there could be no argument later that they simply did not know. She offered to notarize it herself right there in that office whenever I was ready, and to help me file it with the county so it existed on the public record, the same way the original power of attorney did. I asked her how long the whole process would take, and she said, "For something this simple, we could have it done within the week if you're sure." I told her I was sure, and I meant it, though I want to admit to you that a small, tired part of me still felt afraid. Not afraid of Diane exactly, more afraid of what it would mean to finally stop being the version of myself that kept the peace at any cost. 50 years of smoothing things over does not just disappear because you finally have the paperwork on your side. But I thought about that key ring sitting in my daughter's purse, about the keypad glowing on my own front door, about Caleb asking me if I still owned my house, and I understood that being afraid and being ready were not opposites. Sometimes you simply have to be both at once and move forward anyway. That was the moment something settled in me, quiet and solid as a stone dropping to the bottom of a still pond. I was not powerless. I had simply been made to feel powerless, which is a very different thing, and once I understood the difference, I could not go back to not understanding it. If you have ever had that exact moment, the moment you realize the thing you were afraid of losing was never actually gone, just hidden from you on purpose, I would love for you to tell me about it in the comments below. And if this story is holding your attention the way I hope it is, please take half a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep finding women like me and telling our stories the way they deserve to be told. For the next 3 weeks, I did something I had not done in over a year. I planned quietly, methodically, the way I used to plan a whole semester of lessons back before summer break even started. I met with Linda twice more at the recorder's office, and she walked me through exactly what a revocation of power of attorney would look like, how it needed to be signed, notarized, and formally recorded so there could be no confusion later about whether it existed or when it took effect. She also helped me pull certified copies of the deed, the original mortgage payoff letter from 1999, and every property tax receipt I had paid personally over the last 2 decades, the kind with my name and only my name printed at the top of every single one. I kept that folder in the trunk of my car, not in the house, because by then I had learned not to leave anything important where it could quietly disappear. I did not tell David or Diane what I was doing. I went about my days exactly as I had before, ate dinner at the same table, said good morning at the same hour, let them believe that the woman who had handed over her keys without a fight 3 weeks earlier was still exactly that same woman. I want to be honest. Some of that acting cost me. There were nights I lay awake feeling like a stranger in my own skin, smiling at people who had made me feel small, while a locked drawer in my heart held a plan they knew nothing about. But I told myself every single night that dignity does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like patience with a deadline attached. The occasion arrived faster than I expected. Diane announced on a Tuesday that they wanted to host a family dinner that Saturday to share some exciting news, and she made a point of inviting my brother Harold up from Lynchburg and Nancy from next door, and even David's parents, who I had only met a handful of times. I understood immediately that this was not a casual dinner. This was a stage being set, the same way the night of the keys had been a stage, except this time the audience was larger, and I suspected the announcement would be bigger too. I called Linda that same evening and asked her a single question. Could she come to a family dinner on Saturday? Not as my lawyer exactly, since she was not one, but as a witness who understood exactly what was legally true about my house. She said yes without a moment's hesitation. Saturday came, warm for October, and my dining room filled up the way it used to on real holidays, back when Frank was alive and the table actually needed every leaf extended. Harold sat across from me, Nancy beside him, David's parents near the window, Emma and Caleb at the far end, looking uneasy in a way that told me they already sensed something was coming. Linda arrived a few minutes after everyone else, and I introduced her simply as an old friend, which was true, and nobody thought to question it further. David poured wine for the adults, and once everyone had a plate in front of them, Diane stood up at the head of the table, my table, and cleared her throat like she was about to give a toast. She said she and David had wonderful news that after a lot of careful thought, they had decided to move forward with a home equity loan to fund a full renovation of the house, new kitchen, an added bathroom, updated wiring throughout, and that a representative from David's lender, a man named Stephen, who I had never met, would be stopping by shortly with the final paperwork. She said this as though she were announcing a wedding, beaming, glancing at David for approval. Then she reached into a folder on the sideboard and pulled out a document, holding it up like a trophy, and said, "And since Mom has stepped back from handling the details these days, I have power of attorney, so I'll be the one signing on her behalf. It just makes everything so much simpler for her." The room went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone senses something is about to happen, but nobody yet knows what. I set down my fork, and I looked at my daughter standing at the head of my table holding up a piece of paper like it was the deed itself, and I felt something in my chest that was not anger exactly, more like a very old, very tired patience finally reaching its end. I said calmly, "Diane, that document does not give you the right to borrow money against this house, and it never has, because this house was never transferred to you or to David, not one day, not 1 hour since your father died." Diane's smile faltered just slightly, and she said, "Mom, we've been over this. The power of attorney lets us handle your affairs." I said, "It lets you help me pay bills and manage appointments, Diane. That is what it says, that is all it has ever said, and I invited Linda here tonight because I did not think you would believe me if I told you that myself." I looked at Linda, and she opened the folder she had brought, laid the certified copy of the deed on the table in the middle of all those plates and glasses, and explained in plain, patient language exactly what the document did and did not authorize, and exactly whose name had been on the county records every single year since 1983. David's father leaned forward to look at the deed, and I watched his face change as he read my name printed clearly at the top of it, alone, no other name beside it. He looked up at his son, and I heard him say, quietly, but not quietly enough, "David, you told us this was already handled. You told us Margaret was fully on board with all of this." David did not answer him. Harold set his wineglass down very carefully and looked at his niece with an expression I had never seen him direct at Diane before. Diane's hands were shaking slightly as she set the loan folder down on the sideboard, and for just a moment before she caught herself, I saw something in her face that was not anger at all. It was fear. The particular fear of a person watching a version of events they had built for themselves start to come apart in front of everyone whose opinion mattered to them. Some small, tired part of me almost reached out to comfort her, the way I had done every single time she stumbled since she was a little girl, learning to walk across this same living room floor. But I made myself stay still in my chair, hands folded in my lap, because comforting her in that exact moment would have meant taking the weight of this back onto my own shoulders, and I had spent 2 years already carrying more than my share. And then I reached into my own cardigan pocket, the same pocket that key ring had come out of 3 weeks earlier, and I pulled out a folded document of my own, the revocation Linda had helped me prepare and notarize 4 days before, already filed with the county that very morning. I set it on the table next to the deed and said, "And as of 9 this morning, that power of attorney does not exist anymore either, so there is nothing left to sign tonight on my behalf or otherwise." Diane just stood there, the loan folder still in her hand, her mouth slightly open, no words coming out. David started to say something about how they were only trying to help, and I looked at him and then at my daughter, and I said the thing I had been carrying inside me for over a year without ever saying it out loud. This house was mine long before it was ever going to be yours, and it is going to stay mine for exactly as long as I decide it should. Nobody at that table said anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, from the far end, I heard Emma start to clap, just a little, just her, and somehow that was the sound that finally broke the silence in the room. Stephen, the loan officer, arrived about 10 minutes later, walked into a dining room that had gone completely still, and within minutes of hearing what had just happened, he packed his folder back into his bag and said, very professionally, that without clear authority over the title, there was simply no loan for him to process that night, or any night, and he apologized for the confusion and let himself out. David's mother lingered by the door for a moment before they left, and she took my hand in both of hers and said very softly, so no one else could hear, "I'm sorry, Margaret, I did not know it had gone this far." I told her there was nothing for her to apologize for. And I meant it, but I have thought about that small, quiet kindness many times since, a reminder that even in the middle of the worst of it, there are still people who see clearly, who simply do not always know what to do with what they see until the moment finally forces the truth into the open. David's parents left not long after, quiet and clearly uncomfortable. Harold stayed behind after everyone else had gone, helped me clear the table, and told me, as he was putting on his coat, that he was sorry it took him this long to really see what had been happening in his own sister's house. We stood in the kitchen a while longer, drying dishes the old-fashioned way, talking quietly about Frank, about our mother, about how strange it is that a family can share a whole lifetime of holidays and still end up needing a stranger's paperwork to see each other clearly again. The Monday morning after that dinner, before David or Diane were even out of bed, I called a locksmith from a company 2 towns over, one that had never done any work for my family before, and I asked him to remove that keypad entirely and put back a proper deadbolt, the old-fashioned kind, with real brass keys. I stood on my own front porch and watched him work, and when he finally handed me 2 keys still warm from being cut, I held them in my palm for a long moment before I put them in my pocket. It is a strange thing, feeling that much relief over something so small and so ordinary as a set of keys. But I promise you, if it has ever been taken from you, you understand exactly what I mean. I made 3 more keys after that, one for Emma, one for Caleb, and one that I keep in a small lockbox at Linda's office, just in case something ever happens to me and someone honest needs to get in. I did not make one for David or Diane. I told them, plainly and without raising my voice, that they were welcome in my home the way any guest is welcome, by calling ahead, by knocking, by being invited, the same as anyone else who does not hold a deed to this property. Diane cried when I said that. I will admit it was hard to watch because some small part of me still wanted to soften it, still wanted to take it back and make everything easy again. But I had learned finally at 74 years old that being kind to myself sometimes has to come before being comfortable for everyone else. Within 6 weeks, David and Diane had signed a lease on a townhouse across town, closer to his office anyway, and they moved out over a long weekend in November. It was not a screaming, dramatic exit. It was quiet, almost businesslike, boxes and furniture loaded into a rented truck while Caleb helped carry lamps and Emma wrapped dishes and newspaper at my kitchen table one last time. Diane hugged me before she left and I hugged her back because she is still my daughter and that has never once stopped being true, even on the nights I was angriest at her. But it was a different kind of hug than the ones we used to share, more careful, more honest about the distance that still needed some time to heal. The house was quiet again after they left, quieter than it had been in 2 years, and for the first few nights I found myself almost missing the noise, the way you sometimes miss a sound even after it stopped being good for you. But that quiet had something in it that the noisy version never had, and it took me a few weeks to name it properly. It was peace. Real, plain, unremarkable peace. The kind where you can walk through your own hallway at 11 at night in your bathrobe and know, without having to check with anyone, that every door in the house locks and unlocks exactly the way you decide it should. There is a particular kind of joy in watching a house slowly fill back up with the right kind of noise after it has spent so long echoing with the wrong kind. Emma started coming over on her own, riding her bike after school some afternoons, sitting with me at the kitchen table, doing her homework the way she used to before things went sideways. Caleb came less often, being 12 and easily distracted, but he texted me sometimes, silly little messages with pictures of his dog, and I treasured every single one of them the way I never would have thought to before all of this happened. Diane and I talk now, on Sunday evenings mostly, careful conversations, still rebuilding, still finding our footing. She has not brought up the house again, not once, and I think some part of her finally understands why that particular subject is not hers to raise with me anymore. Nancy still comes over with her cornbread most Fridays, and last month, sitting at my table, she told me she had never been prouder of a neighbor in her whole life than she was of me that night in October. I laughed and told her I had just been an old woman with a folder of paperwork and a friend who happened to work at the county recorder's office. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. But Nancy shook her head and said, "Margaret, sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay calm and quiet while she gets herself ready and then simply refuse to disappear when the moment finally comes." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count since she said it. Some evenings, after the dishes are done and the house has gone still, I sit in Frank's old chair by the front window with a cup of tea and just look around the living room at the furniture we chose together, at the photographs on the mantel, at the wooden swing still hanging from the oak tree outside, visible if I lean a little to the left. I think about how close I came to losing all of it, not to a stranger, not to a bank, but to my own daughter's quiet certainty that she knew better than I did what my life should look like from here on out. I do not say that to shame her, not anymore. I say it because I think a lot of us, especially those of us who raised our children to be capable and confident, forget that confidence without humility can turn into something else entirely. Something that looks like love but behaves like ownership. I filed that revocation with the county the same week I signed it, and to this day I keep a certified copy in the top drawer of Frank's writing desk, right next to the original deed and every tax receipt I ever paid myself. I do not keep them there because I expect trouble again. Diane has never once tried to raise the subject of the house since that October night. And I believe, genuinely, that some part of her finally understood what she almost did. I keep those papers there because for the first time in 2 years, I sleep better knowing exactly where the truth is written down, in my own handwriting, in my own drawer, in the house that has never once stopped being mine. Before I tell you where things stand for me today, I want to ask you for something, if this story has meant anything to you at all. Subscribing to this channel is free, and it truly is the only reason we get to keep finding women and men who have lived through something like this and giving their stories a place to be told properly. If you are close to the end of this video with me, that tells me something already. It tells me some part of this reached you. So take just a second and hit that button. And if you feel moved to, share this with somebody in your life who might need to hear it tonight. If there is one thing I want you to carry away from my story, it is this. Getting older does not mean you stop being the person in charge of your own life. No matter how many people around you start speaking that way, no matter how gently they phrase it, no matter how many times they tell you it is for your own good. Being loved and being managed can look almost identical from the outside, but they feel completely different on the inside, and only you get to decide which one you are willing to accept inside your own four walls. Trust that feeling in your chest when something is wrong, even if you cannot yet explain it, even if everyone around you insists you are imagining things. People sometimes ask me, in the comments on videos like this one, whether I regret waiting so long before I finally acted, whether I wish I had confronted Diane the very first time she answered a phone call meant for me. I understand why they ask. But I do not believe waiting was weakness. I believe I was gathering myself the way you gather firewood before a long winter, quietly, patiently, piece by piece, until I had exactly what I needed to stand in that dining room and not waver. There is a difference between staying silent because you are afraid and staying silent because you are preparing. And only you will ever really know, deep down, which one you are doing at any given moment. I am not angry anymore. Not the way I was that October night with the deed spread out across my dinner table. What I feel now is something steadier, something closer to clarity. I know exactly what I own, I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly what I will and will not allow inside the house my husband and I built together one paycheck at a time. That knowledge did not come cheap. It cost me a year of feeling small in my own home, and it cost my daughter and me a distance we are still slowly closing. One careful Sunday phone call at a time, but I would not trade it back, not even to skip the pain, because on the other side of it, I found a version of myself I like a great deal better than the woman who quietly handed over her keys that Friday night. So if you are somewhere right now feeling like your voice does not matter in your own home, in your own family, in your own story, I want you to hear this clearly from an old woman who has lived it. Start writing things down. Find the one person who has known you long enough to tell you the truth. And do not let anyone, no matter how much you love them, convince you that growing older means you no longer get a say in your own life. You built what you built. It is still yours. Nobody gets to take it from you quietly, not while you're still paying attention. Thank you for sitting with me through all of this tonight from wherever you are listening. If my story found something true in your own life, please subscribe to this channel. It is free, and it is honestly the best way you can support the work we do, finding and sharing stories exactly like mine. Leave a comment and tell me you made it to the end. Tell me one thing you're going to hold on to from tonight. I will be here reading every one of them, and I will see you in the next story.